Welcome everyone to Take Time Thursday on this rainy afternoon in the Washington, D.C. area. My name is Janelle Cooper. I am an educator and special events manager at the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. Take Time Thursdays with the Anacostia Museum gives participants a chance to take time for wellness, health, and creativity with artists, thought leaders, performers, wellness practitioners, and others. We're asking people to take just the 30-minute break with us each week to boost their mind, body, and spirits. Today we have Growing Healthy Houseplants with the US Botanic Garden, featuring healthcare specialist, plant healthcare specialist, Chelsea McKinley. Chelsea McKinley is the plant healthcare specialist at the US Botanic Garden in Washington, D.C. Chelsea has worked at the garden since 2014, previously working as a gardener in Horticulture Collection team caring for the Medicinal and Mediterranean plant collections. Before joining the garden, Chelsea worked as the assistant grower at Greenstreet Gardens, the operations manager at the University of California's Santa Cruz greenhouses, and a research associate for Syngenta Flower, Lawn, and Garden R&D in Gilroy, California. At Syngenta, she conducted trials testing the efficacy of plant health products. Chelsea has a bachelor's of science in environmental horticulture services from California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. I hope I said that right. So for now, we're going to take all of the questions after the presentations, and you can place your questions in the chat or the Q&A box. So now I would like to introduce Chelsea McKinley, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Let me just get this PowerPoint set up real quick. Thank you so much for joining us. Really excited for you to be here today, and I'm excited to share some tips for you all to keep your houseplants healthy. We want to keep our houseplants healthy because they keep us healthy. According to a study published in the 2015 Journal of Physiological Anthropology, they showed that active interaction with indoor plants can reduce physiological and psychological stress compared to mental work, such as working on the computer. Other studies have shown that indoor plants can also enhance cognitive skills as well, such as memory. So houseplants are good for your health. And if they're good for your health, then you also want to keep them healthy. I want to start out talking a little bit about pots for your plants, right? So we have these plants that we're taking from their native environments, and we're putting them into this artificial environment in your home and trying to grow them in this artificial environment. So we want to make sure that we start out with the right type of pot, right? So that's kind of the basis for their root zone. And you first want to think about your plant to pot ratio, right? So how big is your pot to how big is your plant? If your pot is too small, your plant will become root bound more quickly, and it will need more water and nutrients. And the soil, the potting media that's in your pot, if it's too small, might not be able to hold enough water and nutrients for the plant that you're trying to grow. If your pot is too big, the soil might actually stay wet too long in between waterings, and that might cause the roots to rot. And a lot of times when people are having issues with root rot, I will recommend that they actually downsize the size of their pot, and that way their roots can dry out a little bit more in between waterings, so that the root rot won't progress any further. You also want to think about what your pot is made out of. Different pots will have the capacity to breathe. So like terracotta pots, for example, pictured down here, the bottom left-hand photo, actually breathe. They have very small pores. So the root zones of plants that are planted into these pots will dry out much more quickly than a plant that's planted in a plastic or a glazed pot. Plastic and glazed pots don't breathe. So the soil is only drying out either through evaporation from the top of the pot or from the plant taking up the water. So, you know, you want to use that sort of knowledge to your advantage. If you're trying to grow succulents or epiphytes, things that like to have their roots a little bit drier, you'll want to probably use a terracotta pot. If you're growing something that likes it a little bit more moist, like a tropical plant or a fern or something of that nature, you'll probably want to use a plastic or a glazed pot. Another important thing to know is that only aquatic plants can grow in pots that don't have drainage, right? So you need to have holes in the bottom of your pot. You can grow a pot with drainage holes, like this plastic pot that's pictured here in the upper left-hand corner. So you can grow a pot like that in a glazed pot that doesn't have drainage holes. So you're kind of growing pot in pot. As long as you empty out any water that might collect in that decorative glazed pot so that your plant roots aren't sitting in water over time, because that's how you get root rot. And with plants that are sitting in water for long periods of time, you also get anaerobic conditions, which can be really bad as well. The shape of your pot also matters. So wide pots will actually hold more water than tall, narrow pots, even if the pots are the same exact volume. And that's because of capillary action. What are capillaries? Think of them as straws, right? So they are the channels in which water flows through your pot, through the potting media in your pot. And so a wide, short pot will have a bunch of short capillaries, right? Versus a tall, narrow pot will have fewer capillaries that are much longer. And we can demonstrate this just by using a sponge. So this sponge, if I hold it like this is representing a short, squat pot, like a bowl pan. And this sponge is completely saturated. It's dripping a little bit, but more or less it's holding the water. And then if we turn it on its side, you can see how much water is draining out of it. So this would be representing a tall, narrow pot, right? So because there are fewer capillaries that are longer, the sponge is actually holding less water than when it's horizontal like this. You also want to keep in mind that if you put things in the bottom of your pot, like gravel or other things like that, you're changing the drainage. And typically people think that this will increase drainage. Well, actually, it will do the exact opposite. It will decrease drainage. Why is that? Well, whenever water travels through the soil, it's traveling through those capillaries, and it reaches media or a space that has a completely different porosity than what it was in previously, it's going to create a perched water table, right? So that's kind of this section where gravity and capillary action are fighting against each other. And so it creates this perched water table. So if you put gravel and other things at the bottom of your pot, you're actually increasing that perched water table in your pot. Typically there's a perched water table just at the very bottom of the pot where the water is trying to drain out of the pot and into the open air space where your pot is sitting, like in a saucer or your sink or something like that. But if you put gravel in the bottom of your pot, the water is trying to drain into the gravel. And so that change in porosity between those two different soil mixes will actually increase the perched water table and actually reduce your growing zone in your pot. And you could use this to your advantage, right? So if you have, say, a plant that really enjoys moist soil and you have this really beautiful, tall, slender pot you want to grow it in, you can put some gravel in the bottom of it, increase that perched water table, and be able to grow, say a fern in a very tall pot that would typically be very well draining, but you're actually reducing the drainage. Now, what do we put in our pots? We put potting media in our pots. We don't actually put soil in our pots. Soil is a conglomeration of living, breathing organisms. It's typically very high in mineral content, whereas potting media tends to be much higher in organic matter. It's typically sterile. Sometimes it might have mycorrhizal beneficial microbes added back into it, but typically it's sterile because we don't want to be introducing pathogens to our plants. We also don't want to have any weeds growing in our plants as well, so it's typically free of weed seeds. And we want to make sure that the soil can physically support the plant, right? Like that's kind of the basis. Like it just needs to stay upright in the pot. And we also want to make sure that it provides the appropriate air and water porosity for the particular species being grown. And a lot of people don't realize that roots need both air and water, right? So how dry a plant likes it is actually how the plant likes its air to water ratio in the soil. So plants that like it a little bit drier like more air in their soil. Plants that like it a little bit wetter like less air in their soil. So if you're growing up a species that prefers more moist soil, say it's a tropical species or something, or a fern or something like that, you'll probably want a media that has more fine organic matter that's acting kind of like a sponge and holding on to that water. Maybe it has some vermiculite. If you're growing a plant that likes it drier, like a cactus or a succulent, you should probably have better draining media, perhaps with more sand or perlite. If you're growing an epiphyte, so epiphytes don't actually grow in soil out in the wild, they grow up in trees. So they have roots adapted to being exposed to the air. You're gonna want a media that's very chunky, maybe composed of like pieces of charcoal or big chunks of composted bark. And typically nowadays you can find bag mixes for about every type of plant out there. And I typically recommend going ahead and buying a potting mix specifically for the type of species you're growing rather than trying to mix your own, as potting mixes are already typically pH adjusted and contain some starter fertilizer to get your plants through the first year or so of growing. Now, this is the question I get the most with my current position as the plant health specialist. People come to me and they're like, what's wrong with my plant? And I respond by asking them a bunch of questions, right? So it's kind of like being a sleuth, trying to figure out what is wrong with your plants. So I ask them, okay, well, where is the damage on the plant? Is it on the new growth or the older leaves? What else do you see? Do you see any insects on your plants? What type of fertilizer do you typically use? What does the damage actually look like? When did you start seeing this damage? Did something traumatic happen to the plant before you noticed it? Like, did you leave it outside on the first cold snap of the year? Did you fertilize it recently? Maybe you over-fertilized it. How much light does it typically get? How often do you water it? And how does that compare to what the plant actually wants, right? So I encourage people to learn as much about their plants as possible and where their plants grow in the wild and where they're from in their native environment, because that can tell you a lot about the requirements that it needs for growing properly, right? So if you have a tropical plant that grows in a rainforest and it grows in the understory, it's gonna prefer to be more moist, and it's gonna prefer lower light levels, and it'll probably require slightly more nutrients and things like that. So it's important to educate yourself on your plant requirements. And ultimately, we can break down all plant damage to being either abiotic or biotic. Abiotic damage is due to some sort of environmental condition, due like light, temperature, water, or nutrients, versus biotic is due to some sort of insect or pathogen. This photo here on the slide is an example of abiotic damage. So this is fluoride toxicity on a Dracaena, and typically monocots, so plants with parallel leaf venation, so Dracaenas or your spider plants. Common name for Dracaena is also corn plant. These are typically a little more susceptible to fluoride toxicity, and we have fluoride in our drinking water to keep us from getting cavities, which is very important, but a lot of plants don't actually like fluoride. A very easy fix for this is to simply fill up a vessel full of water, let it sit out overnight for about 24 hours, and then use that to water your plants. What that does is allows the fluoride and also some of the chlorine that might be in your water to evaporate, and that way you won't have those issues with your potted plants. Now I want to talk about just 3 kind of common pests that you might find on your indoor houseplants and how you can try to deal with these and identify them properly. So first off, we have spider mites. These are teeny tiny. Down here in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a picture of close-up picture of 2 spotted spider mite. And these are fairly easy to identify if you do have a hand lens, magnifying glass, or even like one of those macro lenses for your iPhone or something like that. You can get a kind of close-up photo of it, and they're called 2-spotted because they have 2 spots on either side of their abdomen. There are different types of spider mites out there, but this is one of the most common. When populations get really, really high, you'll start seeing webbing. So the picture top right, where it'll look dusty and there's these sort of cobwebs on your plants. Sometimes you'll get actual spiders living on your plants, which can be fine and actually beneficial. The way you can tell a difference between spider mite webbing and like an actual spider's web is that typically spider mites will have a bunch of little tiny particles, and these will either be mites or eggs or their exoskeletons that they've left behind. So it'll look much more dusty, and you might even see them moving around and crawling in that webbing versus a spider's web. You won't see as many particles stuck in it. The damage of spider mites typically looks like silvering or kind of a dusty appearance to the leaf surface. And when you do have really high populations where you're seeing webbing, I usually tell people that you need to do something ASAP. This can be an indication of a very serious outbreak. So you want to go ahead and take that plant to your sink or your shower or outside and just spray it off with some water. Try to knock off all that webbing and get as many spider mites as possible off of your plant. And then you'll want to spray your plant either with horticultural oil or horticultural soap or a miticide. So it's important to know that spider mites and spiders are not insects. They are arachnids, right? So insects have 6 legs as adults. Arachnids have 8 legs. So a lot of insecticides, chemical insecticides, actually do not work on mites or spiders because they have a different physiology. So if you are using chemical miticide or insecticide, if you're using a chemical insecticide, you want to make sure that mites are specifically listed on the label as one of the pests that are controlled. You also want to read the label in its entirety because I've seen a lot of insecticides that are marketed towards consumers. You can buy them, at your local garden center, and they're highly toxic. So make sure you read the entire label and follow the instructions. There are safer ones that are out there on the market, but I suggest you look at the active ingredient and maybe Google it and do some research on it before applying that particular pesticide. And just make sure that you follow all of the safety precautions, not just for yourself, but for any furry friends or little ones you might have at home. Next up, we have thrips. These are also teeny tiny. We have a close-up of them right here, the left photo on the slide, and this is definitely very much a close-up. They are typically only about 0.5 millimeter long as adults, so they can be a little tricky to see. If you have really good vision, you can see them with the naked eye. Otherwise, a good indication is just the damage that they leave behind. So they cause distorted new growth, and sometimes like the sort of patchy scarring on the leaves or the flowers. Sometimes there will be these black specks, maybe with some patchy silvering on the leaves, and these black specks are frass or insect poop. And thrips are very difficult to control because they have a few life stages that live on the plant, and then life stage that lives in the soil, right? So the pupa tend to pupate in the soil. So they can be very tricky to control because you might kill all the thrips that are on the top of your plant, but you still have the pupa in the soil. So if you are treating a plant, you want to make sure that you treat both life stages at the same time. So you want to spray your plant either with horticultural soap or horticultural oil. Those are great broad spectrum insecticides, miticides that work on pretty much every pest out there, more or less. I mean, don't say that I said every pest. There are exceptions, obviously, to every rule. But if you spray the plants, you'll also want to do something about the soil. And there are a couple things you can do. You can completely remove all the soil from the roots. So taking all the soil out, throwing it in the trash, rinsing the roots off in the sink, and then cleaning the pot as well. And that will physically remove a lot of the pupa. You can also buy in predatory nematodes. So there's this particular species, Steinonema feltiae. It's written on the slide there if you want to write that down. And these will hang out in the soil and then attack thrips pupa as well as attacking fungus gnat larvae. So if you have fungus gnats, these can be really great to help control those. And so if you're buying them, just make sure you get them from a good source because they need to be refrigerated until they are used. Otherwise, they might not be alive when you get them. You also should make sure that if you're treating one plant, you go ahead and just treat all of your potted plants because you might have thrips hanging out on other plants that you didn't realize. Finally, we have mealy bugs, another very, very common houseplant pest. And so mealy bugs are these little white insects. They're white because they create waxy coatings, so they exude wax from their exoskeleton, and this actually makes them very difficult to control because wax is water repellent, right? So if you try to spray them, it'll just roll off of them and won't actually adhere, and then that helps them resist a lot of insecticides. Soap and oil are nice because they do help dissolve some of those waxy particles on their exoskeleton and kind of like dries them out and desiccates them. I typically recommend that you try to physically remove as many of them as possible, whether it's by hand or spraying them off with high pressure water stream, and then going ahead and spraying them. Again, doing that 3 times, 7 to 10 days apart will help control most pest species because you're not only killing any sort of adults or visible life stages that are on your plant with the first application, but then you're also killing any other life stages that may emerge later on if there are eggs or other things on your plant that hatch later on. So you want to kill those other life stages before they progress to being adult and lay more eggs, right? So that's why for most pests, you want to spray your plants with horticultural soap or horticultural oil 3 times, 7 to 10 days apart. So you spray them once, you wait 7 to 10 days, you spray it a second time, you wait another 7 to 10 days, and you spray it a third time. And typically that will take care of most pest problems. If you have a resurgence, you can always repeat that application. Just make sure you're using the right rates because if you use too much soap or too much oil, you may get phytotoxicity on your plant. So typically around like a 2% solution is good for most plants. Ferns tend to be a little bit more sensitive, so maybe using like a 1 or 1.5% solution. Another interesting thing about mealy bugs is that ants will farm them because they produce honeydew, right? So they will actually kind of treat them like cattle, where they will harvest the honeydew that they're pooping out because they're feeding on the phloem or the sap of the plant, and they're creating this sugary substance that they're pooping out. So the ants feed on that, and then the ants will also protect them from predators as well as move them from one location to another, basically like herding them into greener pastures. So if you have ants on your plants as well as insects, you definitely want to control the ants as well. And if you are seeing honeydew on your plant, so the sticky substance that sometimes has sooty mold that grows on it, that is typically an indication that you have some sort of pest on your plant, whether it is mealybug, scale, or aphids.
Chelsea, we have a question while you're on this section.
Sure.
Is neem and or Dr. Bonner's diluted good for spraying for mites, thrips, mealybugs, or is there a specific kind of soap oil that you recommend?
Yeah, so there are a lot of horticultural oils and soaps out there on the market. I can't recommend a particular brand, but neem oil is a type of horticultural oil, so that would work. There's
Okay.
also mineral oils and petroleum oils that are labeled as horticultural oils. So whatever you get, I would recommend it be specifically labeled for use on plants. I know some people will use like dish soap or other things on their, like as a dilution on their plants. That can work, but that can also sometimes not work as well as an insecticidal soap, and it might actually cause more phytotoxicity than an insecticidal soap, simply because it wasn't manufactured for spraying on plants, right? So if you're buying an insecticidal soap, it is specifically made to apply to plants.
Okay. I just thought I'd let you know, we have like 4 minutes left.
Yeah,
Is there,
I'm all done.
oh, you're done. Okay, so there's a ton of questions, like, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them given the time frame that we have. But again, we got up to like 245 people on the line today. So let me start with trying to get through some of these.
Yeah, and the USBG does have a plant help hotline as well, which you can find
Okay.
on our website. I think one of my colleagues who's on the call can post a link to that.
Yes, please
So
post the
if
link for
we
the
aren't able to get
questions.
to your questions, you can
Because
try
there's a
emailing
ton
us.
of them. Okay, let's go here. Uh, Adriana says that she has a water softener. Is it okay to use on her houseplants?
Um, Typically, water softeners, I believe, have sodium in them, which is not ideal for plants. So I would not recommend that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
The next question, I have some Haworthia zebra and one other species. I don't know if I said that right. And
Yeah.
I've noticed over the last year plus, some of them have their bottom most leaves browning or browning. Is this normal? Sometimes I peel the dried ones off and replant, but they seem to come back. Any advice?
Yeah, so that could just be simply, the older leaves senescing. They may not be getting enough light. I know how Orthia like very bright conditions. It might also be a phytotoxicity response to too many salts in the water as well. So you could try flushing your plants. Sometimes when you start seeing random necrosis of your plant, it can be due to high salts. So typically I recommend that people take their plants to a sink or their bathtub or something like that and just run a bunch of water through them when you're watering them, and that'll flush out any excess salts that might be in your potting media.
Okay, you can stop sharing so we can see you a little bit better.
Sorry about that.
Okay, that's good. All right, always having trouble growing alocasia, poly in the house, to lose its leaves. Outside in the summer, it does better. Is that a humidity problem indoors in the wintertime on this plant? That's from Pete.
Yeah, so alocasias, they will actually kind of go through a semi-dormancy if they're exposed to colder temperatures. So it might be that, maybe your house is just a little bit colder, lower humidity during the winter months. So it's kind of forcing those plants into a semi-dormancy state.
Okay, great, thank you. Jalen wants to know, could you explain what a perched water table is?
Yeah, so a perched water table is when let me go back to that slide. When basically the water is trying to move through the soil, but it encounters a different level of porosity, right? So you might have very small pores, or the spaces in between your particles of your soil are very close in your media. And then when it reaches gravel or the holes in the bottom of your pot, all of a sudden the space becomes huge, right? So the water is traveling in these really tight spaces, and then all of a sudden it has to move into this wide open space. And because of water tension, that creates the perched water table, because all of a sudden the water is like, oh, this is a different level of porosity. So it's not going to move like it did in the rest of the potting media. It's going to all of a sudden change its behavior. So that creates the perched water table, either at the bottom of your pot or above a drastic change in your media substrate.
Okay, great. Gloria says she puts broken pieces of clay pots in the bottom of pots that have no drainage holes. Is that bad?
It's not ideal. You typically want to have drainage holes in your pots, because when water accumulates with nowhere to go, that can kind of become a petri dish for pathogens and other microbes. So even if that is allowing some drainage in your pot to happen, there is probably water that's still accumulating down there and just sitting, which can be an entry point for pathogens.
Okay, we have quite a few questions about gnats and indoor plants. Someone says they have gnats in several indoor plants. They've tried to treat it with neem oil a couple of times, a few weeks in a row, and have also laid fabric softener sheets on top of the soil, but I'm still having issues. Any suggestion for what else I can do?
Yeah, so
And
there,
explain the fabric softener thing. That's new to me too.
yeah, I haven't, I don't know that trick. I'm not
Oh,
familiar with that. That's a
I've
new one
heard
for
it
me.
before though, so it must be something to it.
But
Oh,
typically, I recommend that people use either the nematodes that I mentioned before for the thrips. That can really be helpful, because the nematodes will hang out and continue killing the fungus gnats over time. Or you can also use diatomaceous earth, and that works by just kind of cutting up any nematodes or adults that are in your soil. So it acts through like a physical action. It kind of cuts up their exoskeleton. So typically, if you're using diatomaceous earth, I say use like a 1/2 centimeter layer over your entire pot surface. You don't want to leave any gaps at all. So you want to cover the entire pot surface. And then that way, anything that's emerging or going into your soil, any insects or fungus gnats will be killed by the diatomaceous earth. Sometimes sand helps as well, but that's not always a guarantee.
okay, thank you. And I think we'll end it with this one. Do you cover your drainage holes with something that is coarse, blunt enough, like a small coarse pebble, to prevent potting media from seeping or falling out of the hole, but still allows for water to flow around it for drainage purposes? If so, what are your best recommendations? Coarse pebbles, filters, screens, etc.
Yeah, so pebbles will probably interfere a little bit more with the drainage than, say, like a mesh screen or something like that, either if it's plastic or metal. That would be what I would recommend if you are going to use one. But typically, most potting medias don't really require any sort of screen. You know, a little bit might fall out when you first put the potting media in, but once you put the plant in the pot and water it in, that media is just gonna kind of stick together and stay in the pot. So most pots, unless it has like a giant hole at the bottom, don't require any sort of thing keeping the media in the pot or keeping it from falling out of the holes.
Okay, well, we have like at least 15 to 20 more questions. So again, Emily Hessness posted the hotline that you guys can call to get your questions answered. Is there another way to do it besides the
Um,
hotline? Is there any other
um,
information you like to share to get the questions answered?
I think there's an email using, yeah, so Emily just posted a link to the email.
Okay, so there's an email and there's a hotline. So I'm sorry, given the time frame that we have, we couldn't possibly get to all of these wonderful questions that you have. I'm learning along the way as I try to develop my own green thumb, but I realize I might be out of my element. Chelsea, this is a lot. Like there's a lot of information to know about these.
Oh
So
yeah.
listen, I thank you for collaborating with us on this program. We've gotten a wonderful turnout. Turns out that this is something very healing and helpful,
Good.
especially during the pandemic and being inside so much. It's like if you haven't taken up the hobby before, that is something great to get into now. It's very
Hmm.
peaceful. There's relationships that people develop with their plants. I hear people talking to them and all kinds of
Good.
things and talking about their babies. And I mean, it's just a wonderful thing. So I'm so grateful for the knowledge that you possess on this subject. Like you are awesome.
Oh,
You,
thank
you've
you.
done your due diligence.
I'm
And
happy to share all of this knowledge that I have in my head. So
and
I'm
we're
glad.
happy to learn. So we thank you so much for joining us. All of the participants from around the globe, listen, thank you. You've been outstanding. And we thank you for joining us today. Please check our website at anacostia.si.edu/events for other Take Time Thursday events. Also check out the US Botanic Gardens website. I'm sure they're pretty easy to find in your
Yep.
search engine. Thank you so much. Everyone have a pleasant day. Stay stress free. It's going to be okay. We're all in this together. Peace and love. Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.